My guest is Matt Mandrgoc, the head of public sector at Zoom. Matt, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for taking the time.
Jason, thanks for having me again. Great to be with you.
Let me set just a little context for our discussion today. This fall, more federal employees will return to the office. Every week, it seems like another agency is drawing the line of how often federal employees must be in person and how often they can work remotely. And no matter where that line is drawn in the sand, if you will, 4 days a pay period, at some agencies, 6 days at others seems to be the main trend. We all know one thing is definitely clear: the hybrid workplace is here to stay. And despite agencies and even the private sector being 3 years into this hybrid work environment, these companies, organizations still continue to experience complexity in their technologies to support their workforce and their culture. As traditional office space evolved into a hybrid working environment, the need for new technology that can create that flexibility for culture change remains a key factor in agencies' current and future successes. As agencies continue to adapt to the needs of their workforce and their customers, they also must innovate, evolve, and ensure proper cybersecurity controls are in place. Now, how agencies are going to do that? Well, we're going to turn to my guest. Matt Mandrgoc is the head of public sector at Zoom. So let's just start at the beginning. We've been talking about this issue, collaboration, communication, for quite a while now. And I think as the hybrid workplace continues to evolve, it's really becoming more important than ever. So what are some of those initial challenges? What are some of those initial trends you're seeing around unified communications?
Yeah, great question, Jason. So as you look, there's a couple of key factors that tie into what the challenges are as people are evolving. And people have been evolving to hybrid for the last couple of years, but yet some are still forced and challenged with some of the current things in place. So a lot of it really comes around a couple of things. One is forced technology. So where technology is forced upon users or end user customers in the government, from that point, they're not looking at productivity as an opportunity to go forward. And the technology that they're using, they have to look at how that helps with productivity, how does that retain your employees and allow them to work not only in the office, but to work in a remote environment. The second is around end user complexity. The complexity around where individuals have multiple steps they have to do to engage with others, whether they're working in the office or a hybrid environment. So the end user complexity comes in where you may be in a conference room and how you're interacting with individuals who are remote. And then the third is around legacy systems. The legacy systems really have not been able to evolve. So as we're going through, the government's going through this IT modernization, they need to look at how are systems allowing these individuals to work in the hybrid environment. We've seen one agency was spending almost $5 to $7 million just for equipment that was sitting as people were working in a hybrid environment, and it didn't scale. So now as the government is making these decisions and they start to look at it, we'll talk a little bit about this a little later on, around total cost of ownership, how do they start to look at that overall in these challenges that go across there? And then the last I'll bring up is really around the recruitment, the retaining, and the productivity of the government end user. As you look across there, these executive orders around the customer experience really allows for them to take a look at this much differently. As we talked about forced technology, how do you start to look at understanding and getting input from these end users, bringing it back and utilizing the technology or the solutions or the platform to enable them to do their job in this hybrid environment?
Couple things to dig out from there, Matt. I think let's start with this idea of forced technology, this idea that end users, here's what we're going to give you, use it or don't. And that becomes, well, let me work around it. Let me not be as productive. Is that what you're seeing? Is that when agencies are saying, here's your one widget, like it or not, versus, hey, what widget that maybe makes sense within our environment that we can let you use? Like, what's the balance that they're trying to strike? Because some will say, well, I don't want to spend money on another widget when I already have a widget.
Yep, great question. So really what we would say is around forced technology is that if someone says they have an investment, hey, we made this investment and it's part of our overall package, but that really doesn't help productivity of the end user, then what good is that technology? So from there, you have to look at that platform around what allows the end user, government end users to be productive and be able to say, hey, if we're going to use this, you sometimes have to have also dual paths. where you have just one solution out there is, people may say, is great. This is our platform. But when that doesn't work, what is your backup solution, or what is the solution that's best in that environment? So when we see that from that force technology, how do you take a look at this and say, if it's good enough for the leaders or executives of a company, why would that not be accessible for this? And this is where you're starting to see the customer experience officers under the executive order, where they're really pushing what is the end user input? Where is this coming from? How is this going to help us? How are we going to make you more productive? And this really leads a lot to saying, hey, we're doing these things for you. So it leads to the recruitment and retainment of employees in the government.
I think that's one of the big things that a lot of agencies are starting to really recognize, that it's not just, oh, we need to be better about going to a college or university or be more inclusive, but all the pieces and parts that come together that makes up the entire employee experience. And that actually will take us to the second thing, which is the legacy systems. Agencies have been pushing for years to modernize, to get out from under technical debt. Throughout a lot of the pandemic, agencies have gotten better. Have you seen that slow down a little bit? Have you seen agencies kind of, well, we have to shift priorities, or ran out of money, or is the getting out from under technical debt still a top priority like it has been, like it had been during the 3 years of the pandemic?
Yep. Funding is out there for IT modernization. It's been out there for a couple of years. And I think in the next 2 years, there's still more funding coming forward. I think government end users really need to take a look at how these systems that they're making investments on, get them forward in the next, year, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, putting that platform together that's going to allow them to have a hybrid environment. And we talk a little bit about total cost of ownership of these systems, where someone may say, hey, we're getting something for free as part of a package, or which they really shouldn't be anything for free in the government, or as part of a package. And in that, realizing that it's going to take 8 to 10x in cost to implement that solution. So as government starts to look at not just the point component of it, but what is all of the components that tie together, what that total cost of ownership is of, let's say, a unified communication platform.
I think that's a great piece there, because I think nothing's for free. There's always a cost. So yet we think, oh, well, I got a car. Oh, the tires were free. The tires weren't free. You paid for those tires. So I think people kind of have to kind of change how they're viewing it. The last piece of just that initial idea that you talked about is that recruitment and retention and productivity, and especially around the executive order, the push for customer experience has been very external. Hey, what do the citizens say? Hey, the citizens that you're trying to serve. But there's also been recently, as we've talked to more of the folks in CX, this internal look too. Is that the discussion you seem to be having with some of your client, your government customers around? Okay, how do you serve your employees better? What's the employee experience like? Because that will, again, as we've heard, translate to customer experience.
Exactly, Jason. There's two sets of customers, external and internal. So people are really forced forward around how they're going to do this with the external constituents they work with. But now they're really looking internally and saying, if we're going to have this hybrid environment, what are our new policies in place? We have people, process, technology, and then culture that changes around this. So as we start to look at people recruiting individuals into the government, they've come out of environments where they've had technologies, they've been able to be flexible, they've had a hybrid environment. Can I work in a low bandwidth environment and still have the same productivity that I would have if I was sitting potentially in an office? How to retain those individuals from getting out in the government. And then the last is around productivity. We saw in one agency where they had sent a bunch of people home, and then they realized that they're very, very skilled in a group of individuals, that they were just as productive at home as they were in office. Then they started looking at how can we hire the skill set across the country, but not have to have them in the DC metropolitan area. So they were able to recruit into other areas of the country these skill sets, and some of those people working in low bandwidth environments, being able to provide a collaboration, unified communication platform that allowed them to actually be productive but be in a different location, and they're able to recruit a much larger pool out there.
It's amazing when you see folks put on LinkedIn or wherever else, kind of, hey, we're looking for this job, or you look on USA Jobs, and how much of them are still remote today. I think probably not enough for a lot of people, but so much different than it was just a few years ago, obviously. The other piece of this is I want to talk maybe more broadly and step back. You cover the public sector more broadly. Are there certain trends you're seeing, again, whether in the federal or state and local or other North American kind of partners? What are some of those things that customers are talking about, coordination and collaboration?
We're seeing a lot of reciprocity between state and state governments and federal governments. So you think about what occurred with FedRAMP and being able to the reciprocity to state ramp. So states are starting to implement what FedRAMP was doing. So you're starting to see them taking another level of view of security and how they do things. We're also starting to see us covering also education and all education in the US and Canada. We've seen that the things that we're doing around education are now transversing into what we're doing around the government. So these things are classrooms of the future, skill sets, opportunities, learning management systems. How do we take those capabilities and evolve them into what we're doing with the government sharing this? And if you talk about really, and you look at what the upskilling, people will talk about the next years, we're retraining, we're reskilling the government workers. How do we take those best practices that we've learned from education and be able to implement them into our government and share with those individuals what are the key areas of learning, and starting to actually bring some of those educators, and we get a lot of input from our end users and be able to bring those same things that they're trying to learn, so as they don't have to go back and recreate the wheel, but we can take some of those best practices to show how we've upskilled working with students. How do we create learning environments that help our government customers?
It's been amazing to watch how colleges have kept with the synchronous learning and asynchronous learning. Even the professors, while maybe not all of them love it, or some of them feel like it's not the best experience, there's certain classes that definitely lend itself to that. And I think that, as you said, bleeds into the government too, where certain things can be done asynchronously, whether it's training from the government perspective, kind of on demand, or at the same time, certain meetings, you don't necessarily have to have everyone there in a meeting if it's just kind of talking about an issue without necessarily taking questions at the time. Are you starting to see some of that synchronous and asynchronous use within the government that maybe we saw a lot during the pandemic in education?
We are, and if you think about the hybrid environment, we still see colleges having that blended environment. And the reason why is not just because people are coming back to school and being in person, and I'm going to meetings in person with customers. And we're starting to see at schools, they're also looking at how do they grow the aperture of their enrollment. They're looking at students in foreign countries. They're looking at students across the country who may not be able to get somewhere and be able to go after them. And you're starting to see that as they start to build that enrollment, the asynchronous component, you start to look now at even where government workers, people are looking at is it 2 days a week, as you mentioned earlier, 2-3 days a week work from home. They're looking at this because if they can get back in their personal lives a couple hours and still be productive, it's a game changer for individuals. And to be able to recruit and retain a specialized skill set, or help a young individual who's coming into the government build a career across there, being able to provide that platform for them to have that upskilling component really in that hybrid environment is really a key opportunity to retain them going forward.
Matt, we're going to take a quick break and come back. We're going to delve into some of those use cases, some of those examples where this is actually happening. But first, let's take a break. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Matt Mandrgoc, the head of public sector at Zoom. Now, Matt, before break, we're talking about a lot of the trends you're seeing around agencies that return to the office, and then as they have to think about how to kind of continue their evolution around collaboration, communication, and the like. I want to start by asking about that. There's pieces to this that the agencies have been working on over the last few years, foundations, if you will, that really can kind of move agencies along that in their journey for a better experience for their employees, better experience for their customers. What are some of those foundational pieces that either A, they should have in place, or if they don't, they should be thinking about having in place?
Yeah. Well, Jason, as you look at, there's really kind of 5 key foundational areas as you start to put together, we'll call a unified communication platform, whether for any environment and hybrid especially. So the first, we kind of talked about this earlier, was simplicity. Being able to, it's simple, it works. We saw this happen with, at 2 a.m. when the Department of Treasury was putting together, had pulled legislators and lawmakers together to make some decisions on the economy. We saw this, the being able to quickly move and pivot around this, the end user simplicity. And again, it puts pressure when it's not simple, it puts pressure on the IT staffs, and those IT staffs are really stretched thin. So simplicity is the number one. Number two is around scalability. Being able to scale quickly in an organization, be able to move them along, be able to add people, move things around, add events, meetings, large type of meetings out there. That scalability without having to go through gyrations and gyrations of work to put that together, scalability becomes a second, especially in that hybrid environment. The third is innovation. So we'll talk about a little bit of accessibility next. We talk about innovation, being able to have such things as breakout rooms. We've seen some customers in courts where they'll have attorneys break out into a breakout room, come back into a courtroom. We've seen this occur where White House fellows were working, and they had in a hybrid environment, being able to have people working in breakout sessions, coming back to the main meetings. So that accessibility, that piece of it, and accessibility, it's huge because you're seeing more and more information coming out from the Department of Justice around, and not just, this is not just in federal government, this is state, local governments, this is around education and a lot of companies providing accessibility, ADA, 508 compliance, sign language interpretation, being able to find different ways of language interpretation, or it could be transcription, translation services. Those are things out there that really can change the game, especially in a hybrid environment, because you not only have to worry about what's going on in government agency, you have to worry about what that environment and what the platform you put in place allows them to do in the office. That same capability needs to be accessible from home. The fourth is around extensibility. So being able to leverage investments that you've already made. A great example is, in a FedRAMP environment, being able to, what we've done around with ServiceNow, is to be able to do provisioning for phones, where it was a manual process before. So now it cuts down and takes away that manual process and allows that IT team to be more productive as they're helping their end users, even getting into a self-service component to be able to take an automated process that was manual before. And the last is around security. I'll share that we're excited that was just announced that Zoom for Government achieved the JAB provisional authorization to operate, which was signed by the CIOs of GSA, Department of Defense, and DHS around this in the authorization. And in the authorization really allows now they don't have to do it at an agency level. This now covers the federal government. We have Department of Defense impact level 4 provisional authorization. And then you start to look at where you dig into further on security is around HIPAA attestation and CJIS attestation in the Zoom for Government platform. So you look at security overall as not just what the certifications people have, but really down to how do you have that same capability around an administrator level where you can control that, where you can actually control it down at the user level. So security really becomes the forefront on that as well. So those 5 foundational things really become the key areas that that really people should be focusing on around that collaboration, that hybrid environment.
There's a lot to look into that, but let me take a couple steps back and talk about accessibility first. This has been a big push. We've talked about DEI and A, right? And the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. You've seen new reporting, new details coming out from the Justice Department and the General Services Administration regarding how agencies are doing. A lot of agencies are struggling with accessibility. Do you get a sense that this is being talked about more in agencies, and are they looking for folks like Zoom and other industry partners really to hey, highlight the fact, hey, we can meet these requirements. We can make it easier on, hey, your customers or your citizens and or your employees?
Absolutely, Jason. You see this coming out. You mentioned a couple of the articles and things that are coming out there. A lot of when you look at unified communications, and especially the hybrid environment, people have been so focused around what that accessibility looks like in the office, but how does it look like from home? And how do we really, do a better job in industry highlighting what we're doing around accessibility? A lot of times, decisions get made on technology, and accessibility sometimes becomes an afterthought. Oh, we didn't even think about that. Here's the opportunity now to say for industry to come forward and say, here's highlighting what we're doing. And think of accessibility. Accessibility is not a checkbox. It's something that's evolving. There's things we're doing around movement in a meeting where for epilepsy. There's all kinds of different capabilities out there that we at industry really need to highlight more for our CX individuals and agencies. But there are groups, the Access Board and such, who actually have agencies that have an SES level and an individual who are the key ones to talk about accessibility in that environment. So it's exciting around the fact we look at this as a huge momentum booster for us with our customers, because we're sharing with them what this looks like, how this can be implemented as part of their hybrid environment, and be able to check, use that one point, the check boxes to say that, hey, we provide this capability, but more so as those capabilities and accessibility come forward, that we can share more and more around how we're evolving with that with our customers.
And I think that ties directly back to the innovation point you brought up. You brought up breakout rooms, something that obviously was something that's really rose on a big occasion. I've been at conferences that have been all online, and okay, go to this breakout room or that breakout room. But interesting, the example you used with courts. Are there other innovations that are emerging or have emerged in the last, let's say, 6 or 8 months or a year or so?
Yeah, they're really, Jason, it's really the innovations there and where the functionality is created. Now it's really taking place as how are we taking a look at the workflow, right? And this is where a lot of the CX individuals in the government areas are really digging into. So it's not just about, hey, let's throw technology at it, or let's go look at this. It's what is the workflow? You look at courts, how courts were done before. They had to change in that environment, that hybrid environment. Hey, who would have thought that two attorneys, or they could have a breakout room and come back into a courtroom? And so you look at that piece of it. Now we're starting to look at, other types of meetings, large meetings where two leaders may have to break out for a minute to talk about something privately and come back into it. We're starting to look at this, see this more often in legislative meetings where, let's say, on the Hill or such, that you'll be able to go in and they're having a meeting. They need to have a breakout with one of their staff to confer on something, come back to it and come into it and back into the meeting. So we're starting to see more and more of these use cases. And I think from industry, I say we challenge government, bring those use cases to us, have us help walk through those scenarios or those things you're looking at, or where we can make suggestions. We're seeing this in the retail, we talk about different industries. In the retail space, they're really looking at virtual agents using chat AI and such to pull live people into it where it's necessary. So we're starting to see, hey, how do we start to look at this a little differently? And how does the workflow of potentially other verticals start to implement into what the government in different areas is doing, and sharing those things, right? It may not be 100% perfect, but it really allows those individuals to see that there are different ways that you can do things, but really understanding how does that fit into the workflow of that organization.
What I like about your example is each of these sectors, whether it's government or retail or education or whomever, are kind of learning from each other, because everyone's really still facing the very similar challenges. And in the hybrid workplace, whether or not, if it may be more difficult in certain retail organizations, but there's still people who don't want to go into the store and want to buy everything online. So how can you get a piece of that market too? How do you from your brick and mortar store, again, evolve that way? as we kind of wrap up here in the last couple of minutes, as agencies continue to return employees to the office, as they continue to evolve these collaboration efforts, and specifically, I think the mission and critical areas are going to get a lot of focus over the next year or two or more. Are there certain things you want them to keep in mind, or are there certain things, takeaways from our conversation today that you just want to maybe highlight to say, hey, we know that you're not starting at zero, but continue to make this progress?
Yep. A couple of quick points, Jason. One is look to industry for input. We see a lot of, as you kind of mentioned, I mentioned stuff I see in education. I cover state, local government. I work with my counterpart who covers healthcare, which really has an impact on what I do with the VA and DHA and other mental health areas in the government. I talk to my counterparts who cover retail and finance to bring best practices across the board to our government customers. So go to industry, and it's okay to sit down and say, we want to be educated. We want to see what is the art of the possible, and then kind of work back from there. The next is that the 5 fundamentals that I mentioned about a unified communication platform: simplicity, scalable, innovative, extensible, and secure. Key areas that really can set the foundation for not only what you're going to do now for hybrid, but what that's going to look like for the future. And then the last is really around total cost of ownership, taking a look at the cost. People say something is free or it's included as part of something, and that technology, as we mentioned, if leaders are using certain technology and the rest of the organization is using something different, I think you have to take a step back and say, why? Why is that dynamic in place that you potentially could have that, and having what that total cost of ownership is to implement something, but also having the dual paths that if something's not working, there's a secondary path, or finding what's the best path, but then having the other be a secondary around that. So those three key areas I think are important. And I think, really that last little tidbit, I think we talk a lot about accessibility as you're making these decisions. Understand what accessibility means in these decisions that you're making for a hybrid environment, because accessibility, opportunity to work in a low bandwidth environment can be game changers on how your end users, again, we talk about your customers are external and internal, and how they work, how you work with them.
I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that's really important is people know when there's two different, bars, right? The leaders can use X and everyone else has to use Y. Well, why is that, right? And people that gets out very quickly and creates a tougher employee experience. It hurts employee engagement, and that definitely has a downward effect. So I think that point is definitely one to drive home. Matt, unfortunately, we're out of time for today, and I enjoyed our conversation very much. So let me thank my guest. Matt Mandrgoc is the head of public sector at Zoom. Matt, always a pleasure to have you on.
Jason, thank you for having me again.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.